Video game mechanics. How do you define what a video game mechanic is? Well, for the sake of simplicity and brevity, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. They're essentially a series of rules and conditions that determine how a game behaves and functions. This can range from something as complex as, I don't know, say the day and night cycle of an open world game and how said open world will function, to something as rudimentary and simplistic as jumping in a platformer. In other words, no matter how intricate or straightforward a mechanic is implemented, one thing rings exponentially true. If you don't have mechanics, you don't have a video game. However, in more than a few instances, a video game will introduce a novel and rather compelling mechanic that ends up being used in only a handful of extremely niche scenarios, either due to development issues, being outclassed by other more handy mechanics, or sometimes a mixture of both. Take, for example, 1994's Donkey Kong Country, which marked the first time that the titular ape starred as the hero in his own platforming adventure. This game has numerous animal buddies that assist you on your journey, from Rambi the Rhino to Ungard the Swordfish, but there's one in particular that we're gonna fixate on today, and that's Squawks the Parrot. He plays a fairly pivotal role in most of the games, but in the original Donkey Kong Country, he's used as a light source for levels that put you in pitch black darkness. And by levels, as in plural, I mean one singular level, because he only appears in torchlight trouble. What a shame. This is what I'm talking about today, mechanics that, at face value, could provide a neat addition to gameplay, only to be used so infrequently that you wonder why they were coded in the game to begin with. Enjoy! Alright, so let's kick things off by talking about some Smash Bros. Super Smash Bros. 4 was the long-awaited addition to the highly regarded Super Smash Bros. Series, and needless to say, this game was giving you everything in the kitchen sink when it came to features. 21 new fighters, more stages, the possibility of having up to 8 players on the screen at once. This game had it all. Okay, well maybe not all, I mean Ultimate kind of blew it out of the water when it came to content, but you get what I mean. However, there's one feature that didn't have nearly as much of a lasting impact as the others, despite being one of the most unique selling points of the game: custom moves. Custom moves allowed you to swap out a character's special attack in favor of a different one. Granted, I'm being a bit charitable here because a vast majority of the roster was bestowed with custom moves that only moderately adjusted certain properties of their special attacks, but they were still noticeable alterations nonetheless. For example, Mario's neutral special, which sees him hurling a fireball on the ground, can be swapped for either a faster yet slightly weaker one, or a larger one that lacks the range. Sounds like a fun little addition, right? Well, in certain aspects, yeah, it's a pretty nifty mechanic that encourages creativity and experimentation with the characters. And hell, it even helped improve the viability of certain characters such as Ganondorf, whose recovery could be moderately refined to make him have at least a modicum of a chance to make it back on stage. I mean, this is still Smash Bros. Ganondorf we're talking about though, so don't get too excited. However, this mechanic was so shoddily and inconsistently implemented that players almost immediately abandoned it as soon as it was discovered. Firstly, you have to understand that there were 2 characters in this game that came preloaded with all custom moves unlocked, those being Palutena and the Mii fighters. This is because they were deliberately designed to be the characters that showcased custom moves, which also explains why their custom moves actually change the attacks rather than modifying already existing ones. But what about the other characters? Well, get this. You have to unlock the rest of the custom moves for each character by just playing the game. Doesn't sound too bad at first. The problem is that there was no clear-cut method to unlocking all of the abilities, so you'd essentially be wasting hours upon hours charging through classic mode, all-star mode, or any other mode that you can imagine with just a mere chance of unlocking a random custom move. Considering that each character had 8 custom moves that could be unlocked, you can imagine how tedious and cumbersome of an ordeal this was. This leads me to my next point, the competitive scene. Good God almighty, Smash Pro players are so needlessly hard to satiate. Give them a stage where more than 2 platforms move at a slight pivot, and they'll be screaming bloody murder and darting away like it's a stick of deodorant. Do you really think these guys were gonna let custom moves slide? I don't think so. And on top of all of that, it just kind of felt like Nintendo was doing everything in their power to prevent you from using custom moves, because there were just so many stipulations in place if you wanted to use them. You couldn't use them in online mode unless you decided to play with friends, the aforementioned unlock requirements were too much of a chore to contend with, and as the final nail in the tightly sealed coffin, when DLC characters were released, not a single one was given custom moves, meaning that Nintendo had essentially abandoned the idea halfway through the game's life cycle. They technically made a return in Smash Ultimate, although it was restricted to the Mii fighters exclusively, which if you ask me, kinda makes sense. It's the Miis, their whole selling point is the customization aspect. Will custom moves ever make a return in the Smash series? I'm not entirely sure, but if you ask me, it's about as likely as Travis Touchdown getting a dedicated fighter slot, and considering that he does this in order to recharge his laser sword, yeah, I'd argue the chances are pretty slim, but hey, at least we got a Mii costume.
Alright, listen up! But they're blind.
In the modern era of video games, you'd be hard-pressed to find as much of an abundance of licensed movie tie-in games as you did during the 2000s. We're talking about everything from King Kong to Spider-Man 2 to the SpongeBob movie, to the laughably atrocious Fight Club, which came out 5 years after the movie and features Fred Durst, yes, the Fred Durst, as a playable fighter. Who in the fresh fuck decided to greenlight this? However, the one that we're fixating on today is Shrek 2, released in 2004 alongside the movie. Now listen, I love Shrek 2, the movie. It's one of my favorite animated films of all time, and I would argue that it's a rare case in which the sequel is better than the already fantastic original. As for the game, I mean, yeah, it's pretty decent. It's nowhere near as prestigious as Shrek Super Slam, which proudly sits atop my do not touch or I'll touch you consensually rack, but it gets the job done. Now, Shrek 2 lets you play as 9 different characters throughout its campaign, each of which are equipped with unique abilities, combat styles, and even character stats. Yes, character stats. Shrek can pick up heavy objects and enemies, Donkey can kick down doors, Fiona can slow down time, the list goes on. Yeah, this game is the closest thing that we will ever get to a Shrek RPG. While you can't select the members of your team as they're already predetermined for each level, they'll generally be seen in at least 2 or more levels throughout the story mode, that is with one exception. In the 4th to last level, Prison Break, you'll be playing as Red Riding Hood, Gingy, the Big Bad Wolf, and a Tinkerbell knockoff that's given the less lawsuit-prone name of Fairy. While the other 3 characters have some fairly practical special mechanics, the Fairies is easily the most unique one in the entire game. Pressing the special attack button will allow you to toss a handful of fairy dust that, upon contact, causes the target to float in the air. This seems like more of a cute novelty than a full-fledged mechanic at first, but you can actually use this to your benefit because enemies that are caught hovering in the air can't attack, meaning that you can land some free hits and potentially wipe out their health bar before their feet touch the ground. Mind you, this game doesn't have a block button and enemies can charge right through your attacks, so trust me, this thing is an absolute godsend in the right hands. You can even toss some over to your teammates and watch as they glide over enemies in majestic fashion. However, there's a bit of a problem with this. The Fairy is only playable in 1 level, that being the aforementioned Prison Break, and 1 bonus minigame called Crash Coliseum. In this minigame, you can play as Shrek, Fiona, Donkey, and Fairy, and your goal is pretty simple: annihilate everything in sight. When playing as Fairy, however, you begin to notice that something's a little bit off. As it turns out, the developers did not program a flying animation for characters other than the ones that show up in Prison Break, meaning that the fairy dust mechanic only properly functions on a handful of enemies in the bonus game, but not your teammates and not the other types of enemies. This means that the full functionality of fairy dust is only truly implemented in 1 level and never resurfaces in the game again. It's even led some players to believe that Fairy was a last-minute addition to the game given her scarcity of appearances and notable lack of functionality for one of her most unique mechanics. The Legend of Zelda series in particular is notorious for its shockingly high quantity of underused mechanics. This is primarily due to the series' emphasis on dungeons, which will generally introduce a brand new mechanic to the game, only for said mechanic to never be used again after completing their respective dungeon. For example, Link's Awakening has the Magic Rod, a cartoonishly overpowered weapon that's only utilized a handful of times in the final dungeon, and using it anywhere else reveals that there are a surprising number of enemies who are barely affected by it. Most of the masks in Majora's Mask will only function once or twice during specific key events, only to be never usable afterwards aside from cosmetic use cases. And don't even get me started on that fucking spinning wheel from Twilight Princess. It played a key role in easily one of the best dungeons in the entire series, the Arbiter's Grounds, but has, quite literally, no other use case outside of that. It's not even a good alternative to running because without rails, which, mind you, are only found in the Arbiter's Grounds as far as I know, this thing will lose its momentum in a pretty brisk amount of time. However, the one that I wanted to talk about originates from Ocarina of Time. I don't need to explain how much of an impact Ocarina of Time had on the video game scene, but for such a pivotal and monumental achievement of a title, it has quite the laundry list of underutilized mechanics. For the sake of this video, however, the main focal point that we're going to take a look at is a little something called Din's Fire. Early on in the game, after completing Dodongo's Cavern and acquiring bombs, head to the outside of Hyrule Castle, then head over to the fork in the road, and on the right, you'll uncover a dead end sign. Use a bomb to blow it up, and after heading inside, the Great Fairy will grant you the power of Din's Fire. Din's Fire is one of the 3 magical spells that you can learn in the game, and interestingly enough, it's the only one that's actually required to beat the game. Upon usage, Din's Fire will encompass Link in a scorching hot sphere of flames at the expense of 6 magic points. And I'll be honest, this game really sells the badass factor of this thing, as Link winds up his stance, strikes a pose, and unleashes a war cry that could realistically only startle a grasshopper, but the flames more than compensate for that. What is this actually used for, though? Well, you can use this to attack enemies, but the problem is that you're rarely, if ever, going to be in a situation where encircling yourself in a ball of flames is going to be more useful than just, you know, using your sword, which, as you could probably guess, does not drain your magic bar. However, where does the whole required to beat the game factor come into play? Well, you have to wait until you've progressed to the Shadow Temple, which is a fairly late game dungeon, and at the entrance you'll find a collection of torches that are just begging to be caressed by the sweet embrace of fire. Ooh, how seductive. Use Din's Fire and you'll be able to unveil the entrance, which, as far as I know, is one of 2 required use cases for this spell, but I've also heard whispers of the fire arrows being an alternate method of opening the dungeon, but hey, don't quote me on that. The other mandatory use case comes into play while you're inside the Shadow Temple, as you'll have to use this thing in order to prevent a spiked wooden wall trap from skewering poor Link. As if the use cases for this thing weren't sporadic and infrequent enough, remember earlier when I said that you could use this thing on enemies as a cinematic offensive tactic? Well, the problem is that you'll run into other enemies who are completely immune to the attack, with the Keese being a notable example, as they'll actually harness Din's Fire and use it to their advantage instead. So once again, it's just better to use your trusty sword in the heat of combat instead. Thankfully, Din's Fire was given somewhat of a revival when Zelda made her debut appearance in Super Smash Bros. Melee, as the aforementioned magical attack is actually assigned to her side special, and has been a staple part of her kit ever since. But she's been labeled as a low tier in every Smash game, so has it really been given its due justice? Yeah. Yeah, sure, I think it has. Alright, now let's start itching into the controversial territory, because now I'm talking about one of the most underappreciated reboots in gaming history, DMC Devil May Cry. Okay, wait, don't leave! Okay, listen, I don't know how many die-hard Devil May Cry fans are watching this, and frankly, I probably don't want to know. I can already assume that most of them are clinging onto their Dante body pillows when they're not writing Wattpad stories about how Nero and Virgil are freaks in the streets and in the sheets. But I love the Devil May Cry series, as it's the quintessential hack-and-slash franchise that gets the blood pumping just as much as it gets spilt. 2013's DMC Devil May Cry was a rather brazen risk, one that, while positively reviewed by critics and commercially successful after a number of years, was widely viewed by hardcore fans as a regressive point in the franchise's history. It was set in an alternate universe, Dante was noticeably more snarky and rebellious than before, and oh my god, what happened to his fucking hair? Hashtag not my Dante. It's a damn shame too, because despite some notable flaws, I actually had a pretty great time with this game. Now that being said, there is one rather interesting idea that I truly do wish was further explored in this game, that being environmental hazards. In the first level, you'll be slaughtering wave after wave of enemies in flashy and grotesque fashion, which is pretty par for the course in the Devil May Cry series. However, and this is something you might not even notice at first glance, but you can send enemies careening into some of the nearby environmental hazards, which leads to them becoming nothing more than a bloody mess that I can only assume some poor janitor has to rigorously clean after the calamity wraps up. But remember, this is DMC Devil May Cry Dante we're talking about, and look at how cool he is. He doesn't care about authority or consequences, and you bet your sweet ass he doesn't give a flying fuck about blue-collar workers. What a rebellious soul. Now, with such a hilariously gruesome method of dispatching your foes, you would think that environmental hazards would play a key role in the gameplay loop of DMC Devil May Cry. Well, for those who thought so, you might need to attend one of those support seminars with the fans that miss Dante's luscious white hair. Sadly, this mechanic wasn't utilized to its full potential, as most of the levels almost exclusively rely on holes and empty chasms as the closest parallels to environmental hazards. I mean, come on, they're just not the same. I want to throw a demon into a makeshift meat grinder. I want to crush a succubus with a collapsing building. I want to make that janitor earn his pay, goddammit. It's a shame, really, because if environmental hazards were consistently used throughout the game's levels, then I think they would have been a fairly well-regarded slew of additions to the series in a game that, trust me, really needed to make a good impression with the fans. And well, when you have a scene like this...
Not in a million years.
Yeah, it's gonna be a pretty hard sell. Alright, so let's talk about the Arkham series for a bit. Personally, I think the Batman Arkham series consistently does a fantastic job of introducing a new mechanic and making it a necessity for the rest of the playthrough, at least in most scenarios. This mainly comes in the form of Batman's gadgets, with everything from the standard batarangs to the decoder, to the should-be lethal but not actually lethal explosive gel, because of course it isn't. Arkham Knight upholds this dedication to the mechanics. Well, for the most part, that is. Funnily enough, this game introduces a stark dichotomy between two mechanics in particular. The Batmobile falls under the overused mechanic category, but I'll tell ya, I vehemently defend the Batmobile's usage in the game, because given that it was such a highly requested feature ever since the series' inception, you know damn well that the game would have received criticism if the Batmobile's only function was to transport you from point A to point B. And also, the Batmobile sections just didn't really bother me that much. I don't know, that's just me. That being said, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you have the ability to use gadgets while gliding. Admittedly, gadget gliding, which is what I'm going to be informally referring to this mechanic as, is a rather novel concept that wasn't introduced to the series until Arkham Knight. The concept is simple. While gliding, you gain the ability to use up to 3 different gadgets against enemies and obstacles before landing on the ground. The actual idea itself sounds so fucking awesome, and it fits in perfectly with Batman's strategic use of his gadgets. In execution, though, gadget gliding felt like an underbaked idea that was never given enough time to shine, and as a result, the player base rarely, if ever, viewed this as an even remotely practical mechanic. First things first, remember how I mentioned that it conceptually meshed perfectly with Batman's strategic use of his gadgets? Well, the important phrase to remember here is strategic, because for most players, there's no real strategy associated with using this mechanic effectively in combat. When you're gliding towards enemies, if you choose the glide kick option, you're then supposed to use the left stick to aim at nearby enemies and input a quick-fire gadget attack to effectively execute the mechanic. However, it just kind of feels unnatural and janky to pull off, and whenever you do manage to throw a gadget mid-air, it doesn't really provide any benefits. It doesn't add to your combo meter, it can be a bit strenuous to target certain enemies with certain gadgets, and to be frank, there are some scenarios where there just isn't enough time to meticulously or tactically plan out your gadget tosses. But on top of that, I just feel like gadget gliding could have been implemented in so many other scenarios. I mean, there are 2 boss fights in this game that A, can fly, and B, occur within the open world itself, those being Man-Bat and Firefly. Can you imagine how creative it would have been to have to effectively use gadgets mid-air to take these guys down? It would have been a damn near perfect application of the mechanic, but it sadly can't be used in either one of those instances. There is one, and only one required use for this thing, that being an AR challenge that can only be unlocked by tossing 3 different gadgets at enemies while gliding. Even then, so many players were baffled by how the mechanic functioned that a good chunk of them just didn't even bother. But look man, I'll take this over having to collect those goddamn Riddler trophies any day. That shit sucks. Alright, so for the last entry on this list, I'm gonna drop a little bit of C-Shift lore on you. Just bear with me for a second. When I was roughly 4 or 5 years old, I can't really remember the specifics, I had a bit of a problem. I was walking, talking, and pissing and shitting in places besides my own pants, for the most part, but I was still proudly walking around the house with a baby bottle gripped firmly in my hand and between my lips, and I was not about to trade this cherished vessel of milk for anything. That is until I went to Best Buy with my parents one day and saw something that changed my life for the better. A brand spanking new PlayStation 2 on full display. I was enamored by it. I never knew what a video game was, but I knew at that very moment that I absolutely needed to find out. I was gonna do whatever possible if it meant that I got the chance to get my grubby little hands on this thing. Of course, I asked my parents, and, well, they said no, they were on a bit of a tight budget. But after some time, my parents made a bit of a compromise with me. I could eventually get the PlayStation 2, but the baby bottle has got to go. And without a second thought, I fucking dunked that bottle in the trash can, and a new era of my life had just begun. After some time, I got the PlayStation 2 and 2 games with it, Tak and the Power of Juju and Madagascar, based on the animated film of the same name. I loved the movie when I was younger, I still thoroughly enjoy it now, but the video game holds substantially more importance to me because it was one of the first video games that I can recall playing, and I remember pumping hours upon hours into this thing. What do I think of this game now? Well, this might just be the nostalgia talking, but I actually think that Madagascar is a pretty solid movie tie-in game with its self-aware humor, decent level design, and a surprisingly wide variety of gameplay. But speaking of that wide variety of gameplay, oh good lord, I didn't realize this until now, but Madagascar is essentially a treasure trove of underused video game mechanics. So much so that I couldn't just simply stick with one option. Let me explain what I mean. So this game is primarily an action platformer, taking a surprising amount of inspiration from Donkey Kong 64 of all games. With its variety of characters, a surplus of abilities that you acquire throughout the course of the game, large quantity of collectibles and unlockables, and even a couple of explorable levels that utilize a character swap system akin to the tag barrel. That being said, there are so many mechanics and concepts that are introduced in the game only for said mechanics and concepts to be rarely, if at all, used for the rest of it. Let's start with Marty over here. The second level of the game sees Marty attempting to escape the zoo and sneak past the security guards. The guards in question are only seen in this level, but that's not necessarily what I'm referring to. There's an entire mechanic in this level that sees Marty kicking nearby speakers to distract guards and lure them away from their posts. There's actually quite a bit of humorous dialogue and animation work that went into this mechanic, and it's used a fair bit throughout the level, but besides that, it's never seen again. But the way that it's explained to the player would have you believe otherwise. You can also kick trash cans and janitor carts into the unsuspecting guards, which is a surprisingly hilarious and satisfying mechanic that's only used in one other level, albeit in a slightly modified fashion. Then we move on to Gloria, who actually has a couple to choose from. In the first level, for instance, she gains the ability to eat a spicy pepper and sprint at unimaginable speeds to smash obstacles in her way. However, in this level, you're actually supposed to use this ability while racing against some overly conceited ostriches. While you do use the sprinting ability rather frequently throughout the game, you're never able to use it in a racing setting ever again. An entire racing mechanic, and it's only used once. But wait, it gets better. Later on, she unlocks an ability that allows her to catapult herself towards her enemies and deliver a brutal hip check that would probably crush the spleen of the average human being, though some people are probably into becoming paralyzed if the perpetrator is big enough, so hey, who am I to judge? This is only necessary for one objective that's introduced in that same level, which sees Gloria hip-checking some moles who were trying to steal the lemur's oversized carrots. You can use it afterwards, but it's so wildly uncontrollable that you're better off using her standard roll attack to dispatch enemies instead. Then there's Melman, the little hypochondriac. In that same level, he gains the ability to bash his head into the ground without any of the resulting brain injuries that come with it. What a flex. There's one objective where this is used, that being where you have to protect a pile of fruit called noogies? Go home, Fred, you're drunk again. And similarly to Gloria, you can use this ability afterwards, but why on God's green earth would you do that when he has one of the best attacks in the game, his spin attack? And no, this bug-crushing minigame doesn't show up again. Oh yeah, and the penguins, guess what? They're playable too. In the first level, there's a fishing minigame that never appears in the game again, and about halfway through, there's a level called Penguin Mutiny, which is, no joke, probably the best level in the entire game. It's a stealth-oriented mission that sees you methodically eliminating guards and allowing enough space for your penguin associates to pass through, with a subtle Metal Gear Solid reference to boot. And guess what? It's the only mission where you play as them. What were you thinking, Toys for Bob? However, I saved the best for last because Alex has quite possibly the best example of an underused mechanic. In the final level of the game, Alex has to square off against the King Fusa, and at the beginning of the level, he's bestowed with 3 ability cards that grant him his claw attack. You're then spending the remainder of the level shredding through Fusa minions like an E-rated Wolverine, and look, I gotta admit, despite some jankiness, it's actually pretty fun to use. Then you lay the final killing blow on the Fusa and you win the game. Finally, I can't wait to test this claw ability out in the previously beaten levels, except, wait, you can't do that. Whenever you replay a level, regardless of how much of the game has been beaten, you have to progress through the level as if it was your first playthrough every single time, ability cards and all. This means that Alex's claw ability is only used in the final level, which honestly is just a really elaborate boss battle. And the same applies for the other abilities that you unlock throughout the course of the game. They're only usable in the levels that they were unlocked in and onwards. Mind you, this was long before the days of New Game Plus, but let's be real for a second, even if New Game Plus was a popular feature in the 2000s era of gaming, do you really think that Madagascar for the PlayStation 2 was going to implement it? My money's on no. But hey, you know what? It's not a big deal in the long run, because this game has a shuffleboard mode. Can you name a single game with a superfluous shuffleboard mode? I don't think so. Anyways, I'll catch you guys on the next one. C-Sim and I are going to engage in a little bit of a friendly competition. All right, it's your go, buddy. All right, that's it. I know you're using Game Shark. Get the fuck over here before I evict you from your house and make you move in with Jedediah, you little prick!